I guess it's possible that those of you who listened to last week's presidential debate on domestic issues may not have perfect clarity on where they stand on the economy. And it's a complicated subject. As President Kennedy said in 1961, economic growth has come to resemble the Washington weather. Everyone talks about it. No one knows precisely what to do about it. And our only satisfaction is it can't get any worse. The other striking thing as we look to the coming years and back to the Kennedy administration is just how little some things have changed. Listen, for example, to the words of President Kennedy when he spoke in 1962 before the Economic Club of New York.
There are a number of ways by which the federal government can meet its responsibilities to aid economic growth. We can and must improve American education and technical training. We can and must expand civilian research and technology. One of the great bottlenecks for this country's economic growth in this decade will be the shortages of doctorates in mathematics, engineering, and physics. A serious shortage with a great demand and an undersupply of highly trained manpower. We can and must step up the development of our natural resources. But the most direct and significant kind of federal action aiding economic growth is to make possible an increase in private consumption and investment demand, to cut the fetters which hold back private spending. In the past, this could be done in part by the increased use of credit and monetary tools. But our balance of payments situation today places limits on our use of those tools for expansion. It could also be done by increasing federal expenditures more rapidly than necessary. But such a course would soon demoralize both the government and our economy. If government is to retain the confidence of the people, it must not spend more than can be justified on grounds of national need or spent with maximum efficiency.
Training, education, the level of government spending and private investment, these are all key questions, and joining us to discuss them today are three of the nation's foremost experts. Alice Rivlin, who is now a senior fellow with the Brookings Institute, is the former vice chair of the Federal Reserve Board and the former head of the White House Office of Management and Budget. The recipient of a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, popularly known as the Genius Award, Ms. Rivlin was the founding director of the Congressional Budget Office and the president of the American Economic Association. Beside me, Professor Glenn Loury is university professor of economics, and director of the Institute on Race and Social Division at Boston University. Professor Loury, who has also taught at Harvard, the University of Michigan, and Northwestern, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His essays on race, inequality, and social policy have appeared in the New York Times, Commentary, the National Review, the Wall Street Journal, and dozens of other publications. Robert Reich was Secretary of Labor under President Clinton, where he spearheaded efforts to increase the minimum wage, secure worker pensions, and promote job training initiatives. A former Rhodes Scholar and faculty member at the Harvard's Kennedy School, he is currently university professor and professor of social and economic policy at Brandeis University. He has written 10 books and is widely published, including in The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, The American Prospect, which he co-founded, and numerous other publications. As an aside, I have to mention that Bob and I worked together in the late 70s at the Federal Trade Commission, where we fought over the short people's furniture. Bringing all of this together so that we'll be able to walk out of here with a clear vision of economic policy, it is a great pleasure to welcome back to this library Tom Oliphant of the Boston Globe. Mr. Oliphant has been with the Globe, for a whole lot of years. He's covered every presidential campaign since 1968. He is one of three editors who managed the Globe's coverage of Boston school desegregation in 1975, and that coverage won the Boston Globe a Pulitzer Prize. He's been the Globe's Washington columnist since 1989, and political analysis just doesn't get better than his. So, Tom, I turn it over to you.
Could I add my congratulations to those of you who decided to come out this evening. I'm taught not to make generalizations from evidence in front of my nose. I don't know whether this means you hate baseball or love politics, but thank you for coming anyway. I am going to be very brief. I'm going to lead a discussion for a little while, and then we want you to get up and take over from me with the questions that you have. I just want to say by way of preface, this has been an unusual political year in an unusual time for those of us who have to watch it every day. And I have learned two things so far. One is that for all that's happened in the world and in the United States in the last 3 years, there is still a kitchen table out there, and families sit around it and talk about things that are central to their lives, which are not always central to what we talk about in Washington or what candidates talk about on the campaign trail. And the second thing I've learned is that despite that fact, something obviously has changed in a major way in the last 3 years that has put economics, at least for the moment, in a much different context than it has been in the recent past. And I think we noticed some of that in the 4 debates that some of us just got through enduring. And perhaps in this setting, we can talk about the economy freed of some of the problems that afflicted both candidates in the debates. And since I must pick somebody out of the blue, I thought I'd start with Dr. Rivlin, just because among her many, many credits in her rich and very important public life, not only did she run the Congressional Budget Office at a very critical time, but she also helped run the Federal Reserve System also at a very critical time. And I'm thinking of that moment twice a year when a senior Federal Reserve official has to tell us what's going on and what the landscape looks like and how the American economy is doing and has done in the recent past. And I thought it might help frame things if you could pretend you were giving that semi-annual testimony for a minute.
And I don't actually have to give it.
No.
I'm a reasonable optimist about the short-term future of the U.S. economy. I think we have gotten through this recession that started in 2001. It's been a very slow recovery, and jobs have not been created very fast, and we are not back up to the job level that of pre-recession. However, I think we've turned the corner. The economy is growing again, and barring some unforeseen cataclysm, I don't expect we'll have recession. I think we are probably on a good growth track, and jobs will be created. The problems of the economy are not that it's not growing. I think it's more that we have intense competition to deal with from around the world. We're not dealing with it particularly well. We are losing jobs in manufacturing. I think it's a fantasy to think that manufacturing is going to come back to some level of the past. What's happened to manufacturing in the last several recessions is that manufacturing jobs disappear. Some of them come back as the economy grows more rapidly, but not to the previous peak. And we have to face the fact that this is going to go on happening, and we have to make the transition to different kinds of jobs and make those jobs more rewarding. And that's one of the problems that faces whoever wins this. Yeah. If we know who wins it.
Well, we don't. If I could just follow up briefly. One of the things that has confused me these past 3.5 years is if the recession in 2001 was as brief as it apparently was, a few months at most of declining growth, why should one not be more alarmed at the historically slow pace of what keeps getting called a recovery?
Because I think there are a lot of reasons for it that can at least explain why the recovery has been slow. Some of them are good reasons and some of them are bad. One of the reasons that we haven't created more jobs is that our productivity growth, which was the great thing that happened in the 1990s, the productivity growth in the 90s shifted to a more rapid pace, and that pace has continued. That's good for the long-run future because productivity growth is what determines what our standard of living can be in the long run, but it's bad for job creation. It means that as the economy recovers, job creation is slower. I think the other reasons are, well, first we had a huge over-investment in the 90s in some kinds of equipment, as in telecommunications. We built more, put in more fiber optic cable than we're going to need for a long time. So there was a need to catch up to some of that excessive investment, and we've done that. Business spending is back on a positive track, but it took a while. And then there's been all of this uncertainty and fear. The tragedy of 9/11 didn't actually affect the economy very much physically, but it affected people's confidence, and I think some of this is what explains the slowness of business to invest and to start hiring again.
Professor Loury, if I could maybe ask the same question a different way. One of perhaps the most important unit of the economy that I see out on the campaign trail all the time is the American family. And I have been impressed hearing people's stories about what life around the median income in America and below is like these days. And I was wondering, as you look at the picture, how you would answer the question, how are people doing in this economy at the beginning of the 21st century? What's life like, economic life like for people today?
Well, cautiously optimistic, I guess I would say. I mean, taking into account the fluctuations up and down that we go through and trying to look at the underlying fundamentals. I mean, things are not great, but things are not as bad as they might be. And let me give one example. We have a huge immigration in the country. By and large, it's my impression that, yes, I'm saying things aren't great, but they're not as bad as they might be. And I was giving an example. I was pointing to the fact that immigration continues at a fairly rapid pace, and that I think if you were to ask the broad question, how are people doing? Are they assimilating into the economy? Are they finding jobs? Are they able to live reasonably better lives in virtue of the fact that they've come to the country? That the answer to that question on the whole is yes. Yes, real wages are stagnant, particularly at the lower end of the educational spectrum. On the other hand, the results of welfare reform, controversial policy change, I think, viewed objectively, on the whole, one has to be fairly optimistic about what has happened there. I'm not, I don't want to be perceived as a Pollyanna here. I'm not saying that everything is just great, but I'm saying, taking the broad picture into account, things are not quite so bad.
Could I perhaps probe a little bit into the possibly Pollyannish nature of your initial response anyway? I encounter a lot of stories about the income and assets of families simply being overwhelmed today by a combination of what I would call the rising cost of necessities, whether it is state and local taxes because of federal policy, or gasoline, or health care, or health insurance premiums. that the economic pressures on the family today, at least if one adds up the anecdotal evidence one sees on the campaign trail, it sometimes seems as though there's a squeeze on the American family occurring in a way that it hadn't for a while. Oversaid by me or about right?
No, and much has been made of the pressures on the family, the pressures of time, of the consequences of two earners, of the neglect of various aspects of household production that accompany that, latchkey children and all the rest. So sure, one would want to put that into the mix.
Okay. Now, Mr. Secretary, since we live in a political economy, it's okay to talk politically about the economy, as near as I can figure. And you are so clearly and prominently identified these days as a most active and articulate spokesman on behalf of Senator Kerry. I wanted to observe that these descriptions of the economy today strike me as not Pollyannish, but at least perhaps benign, that no great crisis is seen. And yet out in the campaign trail, the word economy is a hot-blooded word. And I was wondering, given your involvement right now, how you see the current condition of the economy.
Well, Tom, let me take my campaign hat off and keep my professorial hat on, at least for the time being, and say that I agree with much of what my colleagues Glenn Loury and Alice Rivlin had said, but rather than be cautiously optimistic, both of you I think used almost those terms, I would be cautiously pessimistic. And let me explain why. Production workers, who comprise about 80% of the workforce, over the past year, their wages have actually declined, adjusted for inflation. Now, at this time, in a recovery, a so-called recovery, for production workers to have wages decline is quite extraordinary. Also, over the past 4 years, we know the job situation has not dramatically improved. It is better than it was 4 years ago. It's better than it was 3 years ago, better than it was 2 years ago. But it's not better than it was earlier this year. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that job growth has slowed over the past few months compared to what it was in the first half of this year. What worries me and makes me cautiously pessimistic is that most people out there, consumer confidence, I should say, also has dropped. Most people out there do feel huge burden with regard to debt. They see their wages going nowhere. They see healthcare bills going up. As I've gone around the country over the past year, particularly the last 6 months, I hear the same thing over and over again. Jobs, wages, healthcare. Jobs, wages, healthcare. Most Americans don't think things are getting better. Now, that plays itself or plugs itself back into the economy because, you see, people, if they don't feel like they have the money, are not going to go into the malls and buy a lot of the things that are produced. And that's going to maybe not stall the economy, but certainly slow down a recovery. No president is responsible entirely for an economy, obviously. I mean, I would like to think, and Alice served with me in the Clinton administration, I think we both like to think that Bill Clinton was single-handedly responsible for generating 22 million net new jobs.
With our help.
I was labor secretary for half that time, and I single-handedly produced 10 million of those jobs. Not at all, not at all. Presidents are only tangentially related, but fiscal policy, that is, taxing and spending policy, is very important. Presidents do have an influence. And where I would fault the current administration is exactly in that area. By creating a huge tax cut, going mostly to very wealthy people, and calling it a stimulus, expecting that it's going to stimulate the economy, the administration was not only being dishonest, because after all, being rich means you don't spend the extra money you get. In fact, the definition of being rich, presumably, is you already spend as much as you want to spend. Giving people a tax cut doesn't stimulate the economy who are very rich, but you also generate a huge budget deficit, which last I looked was $422 billion and not heading downward, heading, if anything, upward. Spending by this administration, non-defense spending, has averaged 8% a year on average. The Clinton administration, Alice, I think was 4.3%.
Yes, it was very low.
So we have an administration that gives tax cuts and also spends, as John McCain said, like a drunken sailor. The net result is a huge deficit. We're going to have to pay it somehow. And at the same time, a very inefficient way of stimulating the economy at a time when most Americans are very worried. That combination makes me cautiously pessimistic.
Let me follow it up with a question that I recall asking a couple of times a year ago when the Democratic presidential candidates were coming through this library, and we were doing programs like this with them. And can you imagine a couple of major changes in policy over the course of the next year that would actually change the experience of Americans with regard to the economy? Another way of phrasing it, I think, is if there were a change in administration 4 years from now, how would the American people know?
Well, I would say, first of all, it's very important to distinguish between the business cycle, that is the normal expansions and contractions of the economy, from the long-term structural direction and changes of the economy. If John Kerry, when he is president, were to be able to enact a piece of legislation that made health care more affordable for people, that would alleviate some of the major anxieties that people are now experiencing with regard to health care sticker shock. Were he simultaneously to make even a down payment on reducing the budget deficit, that would also be helpful in terms of the long-term health of the economy. Going to be hard to do both. Now remember, what John Kerry talks about doing is rolling back the Bush tax cut for people earning over $200,000 to what they were paying under Bill Clinton. They did very well under Bill Clinton, I should say. And using those proceeds, both for affordable health care and also for budget deficit reduction, well, it's going to be hard to do that. There's a lot of money there, but perhaps not quite enough to do all of that and everything else that he wants to do. It's going to be a struggle. But it would make a difference.
Professor Loury, as you look at the Democratic Party today as an idea-generating mechanism for domestic policy and economic policy, as somebody well known for dispassionate analysis of phenomena like people on the left, how ready do you think the Democratic Party is as a sort of institution to be given the levers of economic policy again? Do you see choices that intrigue you, or do you see same old, same old? How do you survey the landscape?
No, I don't see any impediment or any problem to initiatives along the lines that Senator Kerry has outlined in his campaign being at least proposed to Congress. Getting them through Congress is another matter, but that's not the Democratic Party's problem as such. I think I agree with Bob that health care and grappling with the budget, perhaps I would add the long-term problem of entitlement reform, Social Security and the rest, very difficult. But unless I misunderstand your question, Tom, I don't really see that I'm not sure what you're getting at. What are the problems the Democratic Party might have? That
are you hearing a set of ideas for change that strike you as capable of producing change, enough change to make a healthy difference? Or are you hearing primarily some shrieking about the status quo that doesn't have a lot of intellectual heft behind it?
Yeah, I think C+, B- in that regard.
That's a good perspective. If I could just ask Dr. Rivlin, you went through something like this in the 1980s in a different capacity. Deficits, questions about the rate of growth, questions about the health of the middle-class American family. To what extent is this environment familiar to you, and to what extent is this a different ballgame?
Well, I think the 80s do have a lot of similarity because a Republican president created huge deficits, namely Reagan, by cutting taxes in a major way and increasing defense spending, which was Cold War, not war on terror, but the ingredients of the deficit creation were the same, and particularly in the Bush case, very heavy on taxes. This created the huge deficits of the 1980s, which took 2 decades to get rid of. When we came in, the Clinton economic team in early 1993, we were faced with a very large deficit and a lot of promises that the president had made during the campaign, including health care and welfare reform, which, as Glenn has pointed out, has actually turned out to be rather more of a success than many of us thought it could possibly be. But the situation that will face a new president, whoever it is, in January, is similar but in many ways worse. The budget deficit is larger in dollar terms. It's not larger as a percent of the GDP, but we're much closer to the retirement of the baby boom generation. And we are our saving rate as a nation is lower, even lower than we've never been big savers, but it's even lower than it was in the 1980s. We have become a major debtor nation instead of a creditor nation. So solving this budget deficit problem is an even bigger challenge than it was for Bill Clinton, although we did it.
Now, 15 years ago, before the first step forward, the first President Bush 1 deal with Congress in 1990, the political environment was full of talk. Professor Loury just brought them up, the entitlement programs, that surely there would have to be some accommodations or changes in Social Security and or Medicare to make possible the balancing of the
Right,
budget.
but that was long-range thinking. We didn't think we'd ever get to 2004. That seemed like a long time away. Well, we're here, and the baby boom generation is retiring, and medical care costs are increasing even faster than they were then. And so all of this necessity to rethink the retirement programs is upon us. It cannot be delayed.
And using your academic gifts of analysis, how would you assess the prospects of a serious reassessment of these major entitlement programs, which I gather you favor?
Oh, I think we have to. But it's because the deficits for the next few years are likely to be large and worrisome. But after that, after about 2012, which isn't so far away, then they become astronomical. And the sooner we make changes, the easier it will be. So I don't think we're going to have any choices. But it's going to have to take a bipartisan effort, and it's going to have to take some really serious leadership to get compromises that will solve the problem, and some tax increases.
Do you agree, Mr. Secretary, that the major entitlement programs, by which I guess we mean Social Security and Medicare, must be on the table for discussion next year?
Absolutely, Tom.
And how could you imagine the discussion a little bit so we have an idea of what might be down the road?
Well, I can imagine the discussion if George Bush is reelected. He has made it very clear that he wants to privatize Social Security. Now, economists
said
and
how
others
to pay for it.
Economists and others around him will ask how in the world, since Social Security is a payroll, a kind of pay-as-you-go system, how you can possibly have current Social Security payers paying into Social Security, divert their funds into their own private accounts, and still make sure that the baby boomers receive the Social Security to which they have relied on. Mathematically, you just simply can't do it. Even if it were a good idea, and I have very grave doubts that privatizing Social Security, even without that transitional problem, is a good idea. You have only to look at the stock market. I mean, anybody who thought that they were going to get a terrific deal out of putting their life savings, whatever their savings were, into the stock market, if they happen to retire in a bad market, in a bear market, if they happen to have the wrong picks, they're going to be in terrible shape. After all, Social Security is the premise of Social Security is social insurance against the possibilities that you might make some pretty bad decisions or fail to save or whatever. So if John Kerry is there, however, I think that on the table for Medicare, and by the way, Medicare is a much bigger problem than Social Security. Medicare is this 3,000-pound gorilla that is looming right in front of you. Something must be done about Medicare. But you're going to have Medicare reform and Social Security reform, and all of the options are politically unpalatable. That is, you're going to have to increase payments into the system, and or you're going to have to reduce payments out of the system, and or you're going to have to means test part of the system. And I'll tell you, no politician I know wants to talk about these options.
Could you enlighten us a little bit, Professor Loury, since you mentioned the entitlements first? I am trying to imagine, I think we all are, there's a way of bringing up this subject where stock phrases where we say, well, something should be on the table. We have to think about X and all the rest of it. What is my Medicare need to look like for the country to be healthier?
Okay, I don't know the answer. I'm not an expert in this area. I could refer you to my colleague Larry Kotlikoff's book, The Coming Generational Storm. This is an economist at Boston University. I think it's a very readable and shocking and interesting book. But I gather that some combination of later retirement, reduced benefits, and higher taxes is what is going to have to be done. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like it's not rocket science here. You're going to have to get less, you're going to have to pay more, and you're going to have to wait a little bit longer to get it, or else you're not going to be able to make it add up.
This is true, Doug?
This is true. Let me duck the Medicare question because it's so hard and say a word about Social Security. Social Security is not really that hard. And if I were advising Kerry, I would say start there and get a win. Prove that you can manage a debate and get people together and solve the problem. Now, you may have to appoint a blue ribbon commission and get them to tell you what to do, but make sure you appoint the right people. And because the Social Security problem is really not so difficult. We could preserve the system as it is. There isn't a need to privatize it, although you could add private accounts on top if you wanted to. But some relatively small changes which would not affect current beneficiaries or people about to retire, would solve the problem for the long run, such as benefits go up less rapidly. You index them to prices rather than to wages. Now, that's less benefits in the long-term future, no doubt about it, but it would be gradual, and people would have time to adjust to it. And we've already raised the retirement age. We could raise it a little faster.
Mr. Secretary, I'm going to ask for help from the audience in a minute. There's one other topic I wanted to bring up, but I could not avoid the temptation of asking Secretary Reich, if it isn't true, given what's being said up here, that we are about to conclude another American presidential election, in which the real big choices that lie ahead of us have not been discussed for the people's benefit in the course of the campaign, kind of like SNL Redux or something.
Well, one of the distressing things, and Tom, you are a political watcher par excellence, you understand better perhaps than any of us up here, certainly, that an educated populace is critical to a democracy, and when you have a campaign like we have had, in which there is deception, there is ducking of major issues, there is a kind of distraction, swift boats, whatever have you, And the major economic and social issues affecting the nation are not being discussed, or at least not being discussed nearly as much as they should. I worry, frankly, about the capacity of our nation to make choices. I worry about our democracy. Take, for example, one issue, an economic issue that we haven't touched on, but which I consider to be, over the long term, probably the most puzzling and difficult, and that is the increasing concentration of wealth and power in a few hands, comparatively speaking, and what seems to be a larger impoverished or nearly impoverished population. The middle class, depending on how you measure it, but if you measure it from $20,000 to $70,000 a year, is under enormous stress. Inequality of opportunity, of income and wealth is widening. Disparities are widening. This is not new. This has been going on for 20, 25 years. But unless we face this, now John Edwards did say something about the two nations during his primary, but there has not been much discussion since then. And unless we face this and talk about options, what this means for the country, why we ought to be worried about it, what this means for our democracy, I worry about our capacity to make decisions, quite frankly.
Professor Loury, would you take a run at it, not as a potential presidential candidate, but as an analyst?
Well, the thing that I think is really remarkable here is how truncated and stultified our political discourse is, how non-hard-hitting, how little real ideological fervor there is, how much avoidance of appearing to take a stand that might be controversial, even though it might also be right. That's the thing that strikes me, and I don't know, I don't understand this phenomenon really, but my suspicion is that there's well, of course there's the gotcha phenomenon. There's the phenomenon that a candidate wants not to be caricatured and smeared, in effect, as being, too liberal for America if the candidate says that the distribution of wealth has become too concentrated or that the media interests are too much in the hands of people who have conflicts or whatever it might be, something like that. A candidate wants not to be Howard Dean-ified or whatever. But I wonder if there isn't something else going on, and I don't quite know how to characterize it. But I will say this: I mean, the war, the aftermath of September 11th, it seems to me has helped to create an environment where Zell Miller could give the speech that he gave at the Republican National Convention. I know I'm a little bit away from the economy here, but we're talking about rhetoric. We're talking about what can be said and what can't be said, and the near demagogic character of that, I don't trust my family in the hands of this, or the formulation that says, if our soldiers are thought of as occupiers and not as liberators, here then is someone unfit to be commander-in-chief. Quite apart from the question of whether or not our soldiers are, in fact, occupiers or liberators, or let's debate that on the merits, or taxes. The linguist George Lakoff pointed out in a piece in the Globe Ideas section about a month ago, I thought a very fine piece. He says, look you have this rhetoric about tax relief where the president says it's your money, not the government's. We're going to help you keep it. We're going to give you tax relief. But in fact, taxes are the necessary concomitant of the broad set of government actions that makes our quality of our life possible, that undergirds the private sector, and so forth and so on. Why not a party, a progressive party, that would defend taxes prudently, undertaken on behalf of, judiciously chosen and defensible public goals, rather than tax relief light, tax relief for the middle class, not for the wealthy, buying into the what is really a little bit of demagoguery about our public finances, which is that any time the government takes money from the private sector, somehow a crime has been committed.
More than a little bit.
Let me second that. And in any case, at the moment, you can't say to people, it's your money, as candidate Bush said when he was defending the tax cut in the last campaign. Now you have to say it's your debt that is being passed on. But can I come back to the healthcare thing for just a minute? Because I share this concern about the two Americas, but I think there is something very practical that could be done to help low-wage workers feel a lot more secure about themselves and their families' future, and that is to have health care for low-wage workers. And Kerry actually has a quite sensible plan. Now, he's being cartoonized as wanting to turn everything over to the government, but actually he's a raging incrementalist. He is doing things that we know work reasonably well, and making private insurance more affordable by picking up the catastrophic cost, and expanding the Medicaid program, which does reach most poor children now and could reach their families. So it's not a very radical program, although the president has kind of characterized it as bureaucracy taking over, and it would help a lot.
Yes. I know you have an ideological and even on occasion a partisan view of this issue, Mr. Secretary, but I was going to ask you nonetheless if you could put on your analyst hat for a second and try to analyze President Bush's vision, healthcare vision, of an America, try to say this as delicately as I can, where the individual, through tax-favored savings plans, has a freedom to shop that he may lack today. That's not an unfair summary of the president's idea. That instead of employer-based health care, instead of government-provided, that through an expanding network of health savings accounts, it's actually possible, looking down the line, to put the individual back in the driver's seat. No? Yes?
Yes. But here's the unstated, hidden premise that makes it all difficult, particularly in light of the widening disparities of income, wealth, and opportunity. The minute you privatize, whether you're calling it privatized Social Security or you're calling it private health systems, private savings accounts, there is an incentive for the people who are healthier, who are younger, who are better able to navigate their lives to opt out of the broad pool and to get whatever they can get as cheaply as possible. And the markets are efficient enough to give it to them pretty cheaply because they are very, very low risk. That leaves everybody else in a worse situation because everybody else has to deal with the higher risks that are common to being left out. So privatization in general is wonderful for the people who can afford it and also are basically low-risk people. Gotcha. Privatization is a disaster for people who will otherwise not be able to be in a common risk pool with others who would otherwise subsidize them.
Before encouraging you all to go to the microphones and fight to see who gets to be first, second, and third, I wanted to raise one other topic which I think this discussion would be the worse off if it isn't raised, and that involves our relationship with the rest of the world. It seemed to me over the last decade that there had been for a while a consensus in support of the growing interconnectedness of our economy with the rest of the world. Some of the worst of the trade fights seem to be behind us. Those of us who've been out on the campaign all the time this year have seen, of course, a very different America, particularly in the Midwest, and have heard language about trade that we hadn't been hearing for some years, some of it very sharp. And Dr. Rivlin, I was wondering, I was going to ask you, do you worry about the consensus that is always fragile but so necessary for the country to have a productive relationship with the rest of the world?
I do, and I've been listening very carefully to Senator Kerry to see if he's sounding too protectionist for my taste, because I think it would be a disaster to try to cut ourselves off from trade with the rest of the world. We do need fair trade, and we do need labor standards, and we do need environmental standards gradually imposed on developing countries as they can afford to do it. But I think it would be a disaster to back away from our leadership in trade. But I think Kerry's been very careful. He has not taken the anti-trade stance that I was a little bit afraid he might.
I was just wondering, for example, Professor Loury, whether some of the opposition to trade agreements that might be pending right now means that it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, given our politics, to move forward with greater liberalization in the years to come.
I don't know the answer, but I agree with the concern, so I'm just not well enough informed about this.
It seemed that Bill Clinton was quite willing to take on some elements of his own party in order to advance this cause.
Well, he did to get NAFTA, but
yes.
After that it got harder, and at the end he wasn't successful in getting fast-track authority.
Is there risk, Mr. Secretary, that this kind of if this goes on much longer, that the country's longer-run growth prospects could be affected if it's like an animal that needs to grow in order to survive?
There is a risk, Tom. You've got to have a broad public consensus in favor of internationalism, globalism, in terms of the economy. And this administration, and to some extent after NAFTA, the Clinton administration as well, did not pursue that consensus. We are dependent on the rest of the world to finance us right now to the tune of almost $2 billion a day. We are also tremendously dependent on the rest of the world with regard to exports. Our trade imbalance is huge. We are in an international economy. And although there are many people who would demagogue the issue and who would blame the Chinese or blame the Indians or blame outsourcing or blame this or blame that, the fact of the matter is international interdependence. The Bush administration worries me because by turning its back on so many treaties, so many international obligations, so much of our international structure that we've developed after the Second World War, we are in effect saying to all of our trade partners and economic partners, we no longer need you. So I don't think either party has done a hugely successful job in educating the public about the importance of accepting and adapting to internationalism.
What's the big issue that will come down the pike fairly soon in trade? What's something that the new president is going to have to wrestle with within a year of taking office?
Well, there's the trade with Americas. That is, there is a trade agreement pending with North and South America. There are a whole bunch of regional trade agreements. I think the biggest question really is whether we have a multilateral, not a regional, but a multilateral new trade agreement going beyond what we have with the World Trade Organization.
You've all been so patient while we babbled up here. Thank you for waiting, and fire away.
It might be a naive comment, but it seems to me that we sort of have a privatization of being able to retire with a 401k. And, it's one of the reasons I was able to retire in a young age. So it seems to me there must be another reason for privatization, like take some money out of the pool. Is that wrong? Or, is that what the whole point is, to not have money for Social Security?
Anyone? We need an expert.
Well, I'm not quite sure I grasp your question, but
well, we already have a way to.
Yes, we do have a tax-favored private savings account now, mostly used by people in the top half of the income distribution because people at the margin can't afford to save, and I think the reason for preserving Social Security fairly much as it is so that everybody, including you and me, if our 401k becomes worthless, and it might, have something to fall back on.
If I could just add to that, there is an underlying, it seems to me, method, or at least rationale, that has to do with all the money that can be made on Wall Street by taking all of this otherwise Social Security money and investing it privately. We're talking about huge, huge amounts of money, and I think that's why Wall Street has been very much in favor of privatizing Social Security.
So isn't the same money that I would take, that the government would take for Social Security? Or is it because it goes into Wall Street and Social Security doesn't do that with its money?
Well, if I understand your question, the idea of privatizing is to allow you to, in effect, have a much larger, if you want to use the 401k analogy.
Yeah.
Yes, but it would be a forced saving, just like Social Security is. But again, you would be doing it under the proposals I've seen in a way that just deals with a broker, the way you ordinarily deal with a kind of a 401k plan. The problem, again, primary problem, number one, is it diverts money away from the pay-as-you-go Social Security system. How are we ever going to afford it? Second problem is it takes the Social Security system, or the entire pension system that we have publicly, and a social insurance system, turns it into a private insurance system, which may be terrible for people who make, through no fault of their own, bad decisions.
Well, but I'm saying if you take the money out of going into Social Security, do you think there might be some devious reason for not wanting money for Social Security, sort of get away from a policy?
Well, let me try one more time and try another devious reason. Right now, more people, a majority of Americans, pay more in Social Security payroll taxes than they pay in income taxes. And the big fraud is that that money is now going, much of it, to pay for the rest of the federal government's activities. Remember in the year 2000 we talked about the so-called lockbox? You don't hear about that anymore. And Social Security, arguably, and I say, quote, arguably, is a fairly regressive system.
Sir, thank you for your patience.
First of all, I'd like to sort of apologize to the three panel members because they seem to have, they actually have greater academic credentials than our moderator, Tom Oliphant. But I want to address my question directly to him, although I would welcome any input.
I'll get corrected very fast.
I would welcome any input from any of the other members. Recently, and I might not be quoting you exactly, but I think you wrote a column in which you said that American corporations are now husbanding $1.3 trillion in profits. And I find that sort of unconscionable, because why is that money not being paid out in dividends to stockholders who own the securities and who bought those securities in anticipation of profit, of earnings? Or why is that money not being used to enhance and build new plant and equipment, upgrade equipment, and so forth and so on? I suspect, somebody said that the confidence of the consumers is low. And I would suspect that the confidence of the people who run these corporations is also low. And they are husbanding these funds in anticipation of, so that they can build up their balance sheets to the point where they would be secure in case of a dramatic fall in the economy.
Gotcha. I'm going to just very briefly rephrase my point and then allow the panel to help with what I was wrestling with. This was in the aftermath of the last jobs report, 96,000, not very many of them full-time private sector positions. And I was trying to understand out on the campaign trail whether this is the soft patch Alan Greenspan famously referred to earlier this year, or as Secretary Reich sort of indicated perhaps something's been going wrong in the economy somewhat over the last few months. And I was just noticing that there was a rather large pile of retained earnings. I think at the end of the second quarter it was more than $1 trillion. And it bothered me a little bit that you saw things like the Microsoft dividend, but you didn't seem to see any explosion in, say, more productive investment, and that just seemed to me to be another ingredient in a not particularly nice economic picture.
Yeah, so...
Well, I think the questioner is right. It is evidence of caution on the part of corporations that they are retaining a lot of earnings and trying to figure out what their next move is going to be. Business fixed investment has been rising, however. It's not that we're in some disaster situation.
Right. You'll remember from the recording we listened to earlier that Senator Kennedy made reference to a somewhat similar situation in 1960, and that what we heard. Yes, sir.
We've heard some good news tonight regarding cautiously optimistic. Glad to hear that. However, I'm not that optimistic with regard. My question may reveal why. I'm concerned about the amount of money that was just alluded to that is purchased each time. It was $2 billion a day purchased by the Japanese, purchased by the Europeans, purchased by China, and every other country. I don't have the answer as to what may happen if these countries at some point decide that even though we have been the greatest repository of benefits to these countries and they've made money here or they wouldn't put it here, is there a possibility at some point, with the questions raised tonight, with the war in Iraq costing us awful lot of money, that they at some point might find other places to put that money, whether it's Switzerland or China or elsewhere?
Legitimate fear. It came up in the 80s sometimes. Is it a thing to worry about?
Oh, I think it is. Very, very definitely.
And why?
We have this big deficit, $413 billion last year. We're selling a lot of bonds. We're financing it in large part by selling bonds to foreigners, and particularly the Chinese and Japanese central banks. And I think there might be a point at which they begin to wonder, is this the right place to put it? So far, the confidence in the U.S. economy has been quite strong, in part because Europe doesn't look that strong, and neither does Japan. So if you're sitting on a pile of money and you're a central bank, we look like a pretty good place to keep it still.
There's a good news, bad news thing, if I could just very quickly. The good news, if you want to call it this, is that the Chinese, and to a lesser extent the Japanese, really want to export, and primarily to us. And they don't want anything that is going to interfere with that, so they want basically to keep the American dollar rather high. They have, particularly in China, huge numbers of people coming in from the countryside, and they've got to put them to work. And that's a social problem. They're willing to pay a lot to alleviate that social problem through exports. The downside, though, as Alice said, and let me just underscore this a little different way, is that if it gets to a point, and eventually it will, can't possibly not eventually get to the point where investing in the United States is such a bad deal, even given what I've said, that they start disinvesting, the dollar starts dropping. And at some point, there's a tipping point. And the dollar may not even be the reserve currency. It may be that a lot of people start using euros instead of dollars, or euros along with dollars, and then all hell breaks loose. Then the dollar really drops.
Ma'am, thank you.
I just had a comment. Having recently retired from a relatively poor high school in suburban Washington with lots of immigrant kids, the economy may be optimistic for some people, but there are families there who don't seem homeless because they're sharing apartments. And one family, you know, the parents work at night, and the other family, they work during the day, and they're switching beds, literally. So, you know, it's only working so far. But mostly my question which may seem very naive, but I keep thinking about Social Security and rescuing it and making things more equitable, and not worrying about rewarding the upper income. Why don't we just keep taxing that 7% that most of us pay all through the year? Just let it go. Don't cut it off at a maximum. Why can't we just keep that going so that the upper incomes are also paying that 7% all along? Wouldn't that take care of a lot of the problems?
Professor,
you know what I mean?
Why don't you tell us about?
Well, it would generate a lot of revenue.
It wouldn't be politically popular for the upper income, but it seems like it would be relatively insignificant drain, and yet it would put, huge amounts of money into Social Security. So.
Well, that's adding if you will, a means test aspect, even more to Social Security. I'm not against it. I think that it would be perfectly equitable, and it's easy to explain. In fact, if you really want to stimulate the economy and do it equitably, basically say to people or pass a law that says, in effect, that the first $15,000 of income will not be subjected to Social Security payroll taxes, and the ceiling will be raised as far as it needs to cover that and maybe beyond. Sorry?
That was my point earlier, that we are hearing about some things tonight that seem to be like really big deals that I'm not hearing about on the campaign trail, and that's sort of distressing, isn't it? I think so anyway. Yes, ma'am.
This lady took away my question, because that was the very point that I was going to make, that there is a ceiling to the taxable income, so the lower income people pay a far greater percentage of their income to Social Security than the higher income. But I have another question, because you took care of that one. The other question is, what can be done about the huge percentage that is paid to the insurance industry and for administrative costs and medical care? 20 to 25% currently is the overhead, or whatever you want to call it, the administrative costs. How can this money go to medical care? Please, can somebody answer that for me?
What a good question. The President Kennedy used to say that that's a very good question, and there'll be someone here to talk on that next week. But I think Secretary Reich should, since he knows the Kerry proposal intimately, should enlighten us.
Well, look, you've got to take one step backward and look at the entire healthcare system. It is the most expensive per capita and least efficient healthcare system in the advanced industrial and perhaps developing world, to the extent that there are such healthcare systems in the developing world as well. We are the only healthcare system that is designed to avoid sick people. And the administrative costs are partly related to that. That is, there are a lot of administrative costs and marketing and advertising costs that have to do with finding groups of people that are low risk and avoiding groups of people that are high risk. And if you had any kind of a movement toward either a single payer, and this is something else you're not going to hear about in the campaign trail, a single payer system, or an enlargement of the federal employees' benefit pool, such as Senator Kerry has suggested, or even reducing catastrophic costs, which drive all insurance pools upward, or do anything like this, you can go some way toward making the system more rational. What we have now is just simply unsustainable. Unsustainable. Politically unsustainable, because people are now experiencing double-digit healthcare cost increases as employers are shifting the costs as rapidly as they can onto employees.
I was just going to add that I think this discussion now underscores some of the dangers of the privatization policy discourse, just as a kind of way of framing the issue. Because quite apart from the merits of particular proposals, the Bush idea about individual health savings accounts or the notion of privatizing part of Social Security, the sort of subtext of that focus is against mutual obligation. It's against cross-subsidy. It's against the social aspect of social insurance. It's against the idea that we're in this thing together. and we undertake to do something to protect ourselves, some of us will, thank God, not be in need of protection, but nevertheless the compact that's being implemented here is one where we together as a society undertake to ensure that children are cared for if they're sick, old people have income support if they're not working, things like that. So the rhetoric of privatization is anti-social obligation. It's anti-mutuality. It's anti-cross-subsidy. It's every tub on its own bottom rhetoric. It's every person for himself rhetoric. And it's shocking to me that it can't be politically attacked for that. In other words, the history of the 20th century in terms of the development of social policy, not only in the United States, but throughout the industrial world, is one of an increasing expansion of a web of mutual obligation and sort of social connectedness, implemented through government and taxes to be sure, but on behalf of reckoning with the real problems that an industrial society creates. Families don't take care of their elderly people anymore. The cost of medical care can bankrupt an individual family and so on. These are the real problems of late industrial society that we can grapple with when we act creatively, politically, together with an understanding of mutual obligation. The rhetoric of privatization is a rhetoric of opting out. It's a rhetoric of every person for himself. It's a rhetoric of anti-social obligation, and that ought to be a matter of some concern.
Well said.
Thank you.
Thanks for waiting. Go right ahead.
First of all, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to sit down and discuss the issues that our society is facing today. So thank you for that. And my question is, if Kerry were to become president, how effective do you believe his plan would be in raising taxes to the rich who earn more than $200,000? And if our economy were to be effective, do you believe that this would influence other nations in becoming alliances with the U.S. and focus on trade?
Sir.
I just want to make sure I understood. Are you asking if Senator Kerry became president, would he be able to, as he has promised to do, or at least his program is to roll back taxes on people, the tax cut for people earning over $200,000? I mean, that's part one of your question. And I would say it will be difficult, given that, or in light of the fact that it's very likely that Republicans will control both houses of Congress. But it may not be all that difficult if he makes it a very high priority, and it must be a high priority for him, and if he sells the country on the necessity of doing that for the purposes of health care and deficit reduction. Now, I think the second part of your question had to do with what other countries would think of us, and I wasn't sure about the connection between the first and second part.
Well, would they become alliances with the U.S., and helping focus on trade so it help the economy? And would it be
Well, I'm not I think that the challenge for President Kerry, if he wins, and certainly the challenge for President Bush, if he wins, for any president in the future, is going to be to keep the public, the American public, in favor of free trade and internationalism broadly conceived. All of the polls indicate exactly what I've experienced in my travels around the country, and that is that people don't like the idea of free trade. They blame trade, they blame the current word, outsourcing, for loss of their jobs and for a lot of the economic insecurity they feel, even though, in point of fact, trade and even outsourcing is not the primary culprit. But any president's going to have to do a lot of selling, a lot of public educating about what we need to do, and, on top of that, enable people to adapt much more easily than now to job losses.
Okay, thank you.
Nobody has asked for a baseball score, which is remarkable this evening. And
we have
three wonderful people who are at the microphone, and while it's the hour is getting late, perhaps that's appropriate given the plane flight needs of some of us up here. Thank you. Go right ahead.
Okay, quick question. I also just wanted to thank you for your discussion. And Professor Wright, you spoke to the growing inequality in terms of wealth, income, and opportunities in this country. And I think especially if you look at communities of color and whites, it's very clear. I'm from Texas. I'm from a low-income border community specifically, and I think someone else asked a question about what is the family every day, how are they experiencing the economy, and it is very real, not just for immigrant families, but for second, third, and fourth generation. So my question is if, since you're advising Carrie, and I think we all, well, I shouldn't say that, I attribute part of the wealth and income opportunity inequalities that exist in this country to the U.S. tax code and the fact that it facilitates the accumulation of wealth for families that already have assets. And I think the one tool that actually allows low-income working families to sort of get ahead or have an opportunity to build assets and wealth is the earned income tax credit. So I was wondering, if he has any ideas or policies, plans, if he becomes president, to sort of, again, educate the American public and push for not only an increase in their earned income tax credit, but also programs and policies that will allow low-income working families to leverage that to build assets and, in terms of home ownership, down payment assistance, IDAs for their children and or retirement, whether it's private or otherwise, because, again, they're not always included in the traditional Social Security, et cetera. So I don't know if maybe he's thought of that or you all have discussed that at some point in terms of really creating meaningful ways for low-income families to build assets and wealth in the future.
Well, I don't know that Senator Kerry has specified what he would do or what he would like to do with the earned income tax credit, but I can tell you on the basis of my experience and knowledge that it is a very important, highly successful policy, not the magic bullet, but it is very important. It could easily, probably should be expanded. We expanded it in the Clinton administration very dramatically. And also giving people, as you suggested, assets and access to assets. For example, changing the tax code so that it is less biased in favor of homeowners and less biased against people who rent. Right now, homeowners get a huge tax benefit through deducting interest payments on their mortgage, but renters get nothing. And talk about poor people who can't build any equity, well, that's probably the most flagrant example. We could talk about what Britain has done with baby bonds, that is, match private savings and public savings, and then through the magic of compound interest, a child who gets to be 18 years old suddenly has really a nest egg that they can use for a variety of purposes. There is no dearth of good ideas. There is a dearth of political will.
And behind you, thank you.
Good evening. My question is, do you believe the economy would benefit better with Bush or Kerry as president? If Bush, why so?
Bush what?
Why?
Well, I think the economy would be better off under Kerry, in part because I think he has more concern for low-income people that I think are the biggest worry, especially low-income working people, and because he has been marginally more responsible in speaking about the deficit. The Bush administration, I think, has been totally irresponsible. Now, I don't know who's going to speak for Bush on this panel here.
Thank you.
Let me just try a quick question to Professor Loury that at least incorporates some Bush thinking. There's a narrative of the last few years that the president likes to tell, that there was the bubble had burst when he took office. There was going to be a slowdown. And then the United States really did get hit with a cataclysmic event that in some respects, as we've been discussing, we're still adjusting to. And doing so rather well. And that without a radical change in existing policies, it is more than possible for the economy to continue on its journey to a more prosperous level of business activity. And what is wrong with that narrative?
Well, I think, the basic problem there is 400 and how many billions of dollars did Bob Reich say? The basic problem there is the fiscal irresponsibility of tax cuts in the face of the situation. Let's take the exigencies described in the narrative as a correct description of reality. How ought one to have reacted to it? I mean, it's a little bit like the foreign policy issue, right? Okay, Saddam Hussein was a problem, agreed. The weapons of mass destruction, the inspections failing, etc. What do you do in the face of that situation? And I think one can say about economic policy, as I believe, although it's not the subject of our discussion tonight, one can say also about foreign policy, that the president and his people haven't done the right thing in the face of it. That's what I would say.
Confusing the description of a problem with its solution.
Yeah, I mean, and willfully so.
Got you. You were last, but you were not least.
Thank you indeed. Before we were talking about the breakaway and difficulty with Medicare and so forth, the costs of healthcare insurance, but part of that problem is created by the very large escalation of healthcare costs themselves. And I'd be very interested to hear the panel's views on to what degree should the government do anything about containing the growth of the healthcare costs themselves.
Very good question, and I wanted to throw it at Professor Loury first, and the reason is because of what you said a little bit ago about the social contract and about us all being in this together, because I think one of the President's points about the escalation in healthcare costs is that the individual has not been part of the solution because the individual so rarely actually pays for healthcare in America. So, with that in mind,
well, I'm not an expert on health policy, so you take this for what it's worth. I was struck by the president's claim that Senator Kerry's health plan, the big government plan, is going to lead to rationing. And the thing that struck me about that was that we're headed for rationing. Okay. My colleagues here can disagree with me. In other words, resources are limited. Costs are going through the roof. We're headed for rationing in the sense that not everybody is going to be able to get every treatment that everybody might desire or that everyone might in historical times have been used to taking for granted was going to be provided, at least not with publicly supported provision because it can't be afforded. We're headed for, it seems to me, some version of, decisions about who can get what procedure paid for under so forth, with an aim toward a rationalization of the system and a limitation on costs. So it seems to me, I'm not an expert, I stand to be corrected, but rationing is not a bad word here. Rationing is an inevitability.
If I can just add, I think that's probably right. We're already rationing. We just don't call it rationing. And we're rationing in a way that is
rationing to people who have money.
Highly socially inequitable. Pharmaceutical costs are one of the biggest components of healthcare costs. And right up near the top of my list of stupid Bush administration policies, and it's a very long list, is the decision that the Medicare drug bill would, inside the bill itself, prevent Medicare from using its bargaining power to negotiate lower pharmaceutical prices for seniors. That makes absolutely no sense at all, particularly if you believe in free markets and you believe in the possibility of negotiation.
We have it. Let me tell you my definition for a good Kennedy Library evening during the middle of an election season. It's when stuff comes up that's obviously of immense importance that tells some of us in the middle of the campaign that we have not been doing a very good job of shining a light on the things that quite clearly are going to be front and center on our country's agenda as early as next year. So by that standard, I thank my colleagues on the panel, and I thank you for coming out to maybe begin the process of shining that light. Thanks again very much. Thank you.